Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. I am here today to do the Blind Page 112 challenge. This is a challenge that was created by Shawn, the book Maniac, from a common idea that if you are unfamiliar with the contents of a book and you're thinking about whether or not you should get it, the best thing you can do is to turn to page 112, read that page, and that will give you a better sense of the writing in the book, because odds are an author is going to put their best writing in the beginning. So if you read the first page or the first few pages, you're probably getting the best that they have to offer. If you go to page 112, you'll see it in its sort of natural habitat. And this is a Pride edition of the page 112 challenge. It's an interesting idea. I have done one with Shawn in the past. If I remember, I will link that video down below. But this is a special Pride edition of the page 112 challenge because it is Pride Month. So he sent me 3 titles, 3 page 112s from 3 books. I don't know what books they came from. And I sent 3 to him as well. The idea is that they would all be LGBTQ books, one that covers the G, gay, one that would be L, lesbian, and one that would be T, transgender. So I will link his channel down below. You can check out his channel and you'll see his version of this challenge and the titles that I sent to him. And one criteria we set for ourselves is that these would all be fiction books, because it didn't seem fair to compare a fiction book to a nonfiction book. They're both doing very different things. And we are not really doing genre books either, because again, it seems like it wouldn't really be an apples to apples comparison. It would make a lot more sense to have like a literary fiction book compared to a literary fiction book, not a literary fiction book compared to a nonfiction book compared to science fiction. I don't know. So that is what we decided to do. We're going to get into the ones that he sent me right now. I have his email pulled up in front of me. I have not peeked at what it is. So let me open his email and we shall see how this goes. I'm going to start with the first full sentence on the very first page 112 challenge. Jamie's walking around. She was barking before I started filming. Hopefully she's going to be pretty calm right now. We'll see how this goes. So when I'm done with this, the idea is that I will rank the 3 books in order of my preference, which one I would be the most interested in reading, and then which one I would be least interested in reading. And then Shawn has sent me the answers for what these books are. Maybe there will be a surprise. Maybe there won't. So let's dive into the first one. I have it pulled up in front of me, book number 1. And as I said, I am going to start with the first full sentence of this page. Sammy rolls another cigarette and dangles his legs over the roof's edge. I want to ask him if he was awake the night the sparrows fell from the sky. I want to ask him if he saw, the next day, like I did, a white-throated sparrow splayed on the windshield of a parked car. I look up at the stars, inviting vertigo. You used to say you saw the pair of birds gliding into the roost at night, when the moon was full enough to see by. I take the cigarette from Sammy. It tastes like winter, like the couch in Sammy's last apartment. Kamar has their Walkman out again, nodding their head to the music. Hey, I rummage around in the messenger bag and pull out a sleeve of cassette tapes of Firuz, Kulthum, and Abdel Halim Hafez. I found a bunch of these in my room the other day. My player doesn't work anymore, but since yours does, I figure somebody should enjoy them. Kamar grins. Oh, cool. Thanks. They go through them one at a time, then laugh when they find a cassette of Arabic kids' music. Oh my God. Hassan Shu Helween. I apologize if I'm pronouncing any of this wrong. I haven't heard that in years. I had this same cassette growing up. Reem puts out her cigarette. Mom used to put that on to help me sleep. You too? After Mom got divorced, I say, when I couldn't sleep and she'd be watching cooking shows at 2 a.m, I used to stay up and listen to it. Reem is silhouetted against the orange arc of the Brooklyn Bridge. I used to call her up at night to check on her. She had to keep it together for you. At least she talked to you. A cockroach crawls over the toe of my sneaker and I let it clamber down the other side. I always thought that was why she got involved with saving the Washington Street building, to get her mind off things. Sammy has come to stand closer, silent and swift, between me and the 8-story drop. Kamar lowers their headphones. Wait, I remember hearing about that. That was your mom? Was she the one who... the fire? Yeah, that was us. Allah Yerhama. Kamar's voice is soft now. She was an ornithologist too, right? Before she became an activist? The activism just kind of happened. I avert my eyes. She was trying to document a pair of rare birds in the area when she died. I found her notebooks in Teta's closet. I don't know how to pronounce the next word, so I'm going to skip it. Reem says, you haven't been going through all of that, have you? What good can it do after all these years? Maybe she's right. Remember the day I picked the lock on the older tenement, the one you were trying to save, the one that's now long since leveled? I crawled onto a ledge 5 stories up to prove that the birds you were protecting did not exist. It was a Tuesday, late morning, while you were out buying groceries for Teta. The August heat had burned off the clouds, and a damp had settled over lower Manhattan, slicking the brick. There had been no sightings of the birds for a few days, and most people were saying that there either was no nest or the birds had moved on because of the noise and pollution. That is page 112 of the first book. It seems interesting. Part of what's really difficult about the page 112 challenge, and part of what's really interesting about it, is that unlike looking at the introduction of a book, you don't necessarily know what's going on. So it's difficult to piece together what's happening. It's like joining something in medias res. Everything is already going on. So there are things in here that have kind of piqued my interest. I'm going to hold judgment until I get to the other two, but just off of this one, it sounds like it could be a very interesting book. There's clearly a lot of family drama, a lot of things going on in the past that are still impacting this protagonist. And the dynamic between them and their friends is also kind of interesting. So it'll be interesting to see how this stacks up against the other ones. But on its own, I'm feeling like I could be interested in that one. Let's get to the second passage and see how that goes. And then we can start comparing these a little bit. Book number 2. Of course they'll eat our food, she said, and clattered the dish into a cupboard. I paused in my washing to give her a disbelieving look. But what about spice? My mother pleaded. Should I leave out chili powder? No, just make the food like we eat it. They want to taste the authentic thing. My mother looked skeptical. I could also tell she was nervous. Never having cooked in Sri Lanka, her curries were often too oily, the vegetables mushy, sauces smoky from charring the bottom of the pan. Renu worked on Saturday mornings, and she left for her shift pretending not to notice my mother was cross and anxious in the kitchen, and I was sullen at having to clean up for her friends. What hung in the air unsaid as my mother and I went about our tasks was that we'd never had white people in our house before. We were awed at the prospect, but annoyed we felt this way. Janice, Pamela, Tricia, and Suzanne arrived together. When they rang the bell, Renu, who was fierce and harried by now, rushed to the door and flung it open. "Hello," she trilled. Her friends shrieked greetings and flung their arms around her. Their faces were flushed as if they expected nothing but a good time. My mother and I were waiting by the dining table with the right smiles. Once the guests had removed their shoes, Renu brought them in. She presented us as my lovely, charming family. We shook their hands and murmured greetings. I had expected they would all look manly, but Jan was the only one who fitted that stereotype, with her short, spiky hair, black jeans, and a man's white shirt with epaulettes. She gripped my hand and gave me a curt nod. A flintiness momentarily stilled her features as she took in my mother's sari, and then she greeted her in the same curt way. One of the women said. What is that delicious smell? My mother blushed at the compliment. I do hope you like Sri Lankan food. We were willing to cook something else, but Renu said you would like to try our cuisine. Her accent had changed, as all ours did when addressing white people, an odd tightness to her vowels, talking from the front of her mouth. Yes, of course. Looking forward to it. This is so thrilling, Pamela, Tricia, and Suzanne cried. Jan nodded, grudgingly. So that is book number 2. Kind of similar to the first one. It's difficult. There are all these dynamics that are already in play by the time you get to page 112. And of course, you start immediately trying to figure them out and what's happening. I think the dynamics going on here are a little more interesting to me than the one in book 1, because you have the interplay of race and the idea of performing for white guests, which I immediately find interesting because I'm the type of person who would usually be the white guest. So it's more interesting to see what's going on the other side of the door, if that makes sense. And you also have this dynamic between mother and child, and these women who come to the house are coded as lesbians in the way they're described. So that is an interesting dynamic as well. And I'm wondering the gender of Renu. And I feel like there are things I want to figure out in this book more than I want to figure out what happened in the first one. So if I had to do the ranking right now, I'd say book number 2 is the one I would be most interested in reading, and book number 1 would be not too far down the list. So it all hinges on book number 3. Let's try that one. Okay, book number 3, page 112, is the beginning of chapter 19, and chapter 19 is called Vera's Journal. Sunday, 8 January, 1876. Christmas Eve, after Masha and I readied Lydia for bed, we retired to our room. We put on our nightgowns and sat under the covers against the chill air. "Merry Christmas, my darling," Masha said, and leaned in to kiss me. A kiss that made me glad to be abed, as I felt I might collapse upon the floor had I not been. She crushed me in an embrace then. "I love you so, my sweet Seraph," she whispered. "How blessed I feel. To have you here beside me each night and each morning is a gift. I've no need of further Christmas." "Ah," I said, and kissed her lightly on the forehead. "But more Christmas you shall have." I reached behind my pillow and pulled from there 2 gifts, which I set upon her lap. "Merry Christmas, my beloved. I count myself lucky the day I chose to visit the Alarchin courses." I kissed her cheek, and then twisting myself nearly around, I let my lips linger a moment on her neck and breathed in the smell of her skin. "Now," she said, "if you continue to kiss me thus, we shall find ourselves opening presents other than these." That's interesting. It seems kind of deliberately almost like a Hallmark movie. Like this kind of sweet Christmas scene where everybody's overly loving, overly kind, overly accommodating of the other person. So that's interesting. I feel like if I knew more about the book, it might seem more appealing. Jumping into the middle of it seems a little odd because you haven't had time to get used to the tone of the book. I don't know what book it is. I don't know what it's about. So the tone feels a little jarring. That's more like an episode of Full House a little bit, but with this kind of sexual undertone to it. So it's harder to feel invested in that one for me. And I hope that makes sense. So here's my ranking. I'm going to say book number 2 is still the one I would be most interested in reading. It's here at the top. Book number 1 is still going to be in the middle. And book number 3 is at the bottom, just because it doesn't seem bad, but out of context, it's hard to get into that. It feels a little bit cheesy, that idea of how blessed I feel. That is a line that makes me instantly want to roll my eyes. So maybe that's just me, but let's see what these books are. Let's get to that part. So the first book, the book that I ranked in the middle, is The 30 Names of Night by Zain Jukadar. Shawn was kind enough to provide me with pronunciation, which is really great. It is published in November of 2020. A poetic portrait of a trans man's search for a rare bird and his own identity. Zain Jukadar, a trans man, he, him, is a Syrian-American writer and wrote the 2018 novel The Map of Salt and Stars. Here is the synopsis of this book, and let's see if the full synopsis changes. I had a suspicion that this was the trans one, since there was nothing overtly trans in any of the others. So let's see what the synopsis of it says. This comes from Goodreads. 5 years after a suspicious fire killed his ornithologist mother, a closeted Syrian-American trans boy sheds his birth name and searches for a new one. He has been unable to paint since his mother's ghost has begun to visit him each evening. As his grandmother's sole caretaker, he spends his days cooped up in their apartment, avoiding his neighborhood, I don't know how to pronounce that word, his estranged sister, and even his best friend, who also happens to be his longtime crush. The only time he feels truly free is when he slips out at night to paint murals on buildings in the once thriving Manhattan neighborhood known as Little Syria. One night, he enters the abandoned community house and finds the tattered journal of a Syrian-American artist named Layla Z, who dedicated her career to painting the birds of North America. She famously and mysteriously disappeared more than 60 years before, but her journal contains proof that both his mother and Layla Z encountered the same rare bird before their deaths. In fact, Layla Z's past is intimately tied to his mother's and his grandmother's in ways he never could have suspected. Even more surprising, Layla Z's story reveals the histories of queer and transgender people within his own community that he never knew. Realizing that he isn't and has never been alone, he has the courage to officially claim a new name, Nadir, an Arabic name meaning rare. As unprecedented numbers of birds are mysteriously drawn to New York City skies, Nadir enlists the help of his family and friends to unravel what happened to Layla Z and the rare bird his mother died trying to save. Following his mother's ghosts, he uncovers the silences kept in the name of survival by his own community, his own family, and within himself, and discovers the family that was there all along. I like the idea of grief. I like the idea of this person coming to their own and embracing who they are and feeling isolated and separated from the world and their community and then discovering their place in it. I think that's a great story, and especially for a book that features a trans character. I don't know how I feel about this bird angle and the idea of this backstory. It seems a little complicated. I wonder if it's incorporating a bit of like a folktale or something like that, and there's some kind of an element like maybe a mythic bird or something like that, and the idea of these birds being mysteriously drawn to New York. I don't know. It sounds like it could be good. The smaller personal angle of that book speaks to me. It sounds like it gets a little bit complicated, but I would probably be willing to go along for the journey. I think that seems like a solid choice for like the middle ground so far. Let's see what the second book is. Book number 2 is The Hungry Ghosts by Shyam Selvadurai, published in 2013. Shyam Selvadurai is a gay Sri Lankan Canadian novelist. He is most noted for his 1994 novel Funny Boy, which Shawn says he adored. Here is the synopsis from Goodreads. In Buddhist myth, the dead may be reborn as hungry ghosts, spirits with stomachs so large they can never be full, if they have desired too much during their lives. It is the duty of the living relatives to free those doomed to this fate by doing kind deeds and creating good karma. In Shyam Selvadurai sweeping new novel, his first in more than a decade, he creates an unforgettable ghost, a powerful Sri Lankan matriarch whose wily ways, insatiable longing for land, houses, money, and control, and tragic blindness to the human needs of those around her, parallels the volatile political situation of her war-torn country. The novel centers around Shivan Rasiai, the beloved grandson who is of mixed Tamil and Sinhalese lineage, and who also, to his grandmother's dismay, grows from beautiful boy to striking gay man. As the novel opens in the present day, Shivan, now living in Canada, is preparing to travel back to Colombo, Sri Lanka, to rescue his elderly and ailing grandmother, to remove her from her home, now fallen into disrepair, that is her pride, and bring her to Toronto to live out her final days. But throughout the night and into the early morning hours of his departure, Shivan grapples with his own insatiable hunger and is haunted by unrelenting ghosts of his own creation. The Hungry Ghosts is a beautifully written, dazzling story of family, wealth, and the long reach of the past. It shows how racial, political, and sexual differences can tear apart both a country and the human heart, not just once, but many times, until the ghosts are fed and freed. That is interesting. A little unexpected, given what the page looked like. It was like setting up for a dinner party, and they were wondering about spice and that idea of performing for white guests. I wouldn't have expected that kind of plot. However, the plot sounds really interesting and seems to back up the idea that that is the one I would be most interested in, and the first book would be the one that's still in the middle. So what's really going to be interesting right now is the description of book 3, because that's the one I couldn't quite figure out. And because I couldn't quite figure it out and it seemed a little cheesy, I put it at the bottom. But I feel like if the explanation serves that, maybe I'll rethink. So book number 3 is called Infraction by Yvonne Zipter, published May of 2021. So that's a new book. Shawn says, I bought this book for the express purpose of sending page 112 to you after finding out about it online and falling head over heels with its cover. It does have a great cover. Yvonne Zipter is the Chicago-based author of 2 nonfiction books, 3 poetry collections, and a number of short stories. Here is the synopsis. Maria Zhukova is a woman of many passions. Her husband isn't one of them. It's mathematics and literature that captivate her in part, but her lover, Vera, enthralls her most of all. These are, however, all dangerous obsessions in the socially turbulent St. Petersburg of 1875. Maria is the fiery center to a small solar system of characters, each of whom depends on her to light their own lives. There is her Aunt Lydia, a spinster who, dying of consumption, exacts from her niece a promise to marry. There is Grigory, Maria's one-time math teacher, who longs for his former pupil to achieve the scholarly glory he cannot. There is Vera, a young tutor surprised to find she's fallen in love with a woman. There is Sergei, an earnest librarian captivated by Maria and willing to do whatever it takes to be near her, even if that means a platonic marriage. But when Sergei is consumed with desire for Maria, his anguish over the promise he made sets in motion a deadly chain of events. St. Petersburg itself adds a richness to these characters as they walk and muse along the city's canals and bounce along the rutted streets behind a hardy droshky driver on their way to dine at Pravato or Liner's Deli, or to watch ballet at the Mariinsky Theater. Inspired by a real-life account, Infraction takes place at a time when women who yearn for more find that freedom comes at a cost. See, I had a feeling this was going to happen. The description of the book sounds fascinating. It's interesting that the passage on page 112 sounded so cheesy, almost like a little Hallmark movie, but I wonder if that's intentional because it's meant to be a front or an act covering up all of this stuff happening at the bottom. If I were going on plot alone, it's still a tough call between 2 and that third one, but I might actually be interested in book number 3 the most, simply based on the description of it, which is fascinating. And it's funny too, because I get the idea of page 112. You go into that page, so things are already ongoing, but I find that it's frequently very difficult to figure out what's happening without any of the context that builds up to that page. And I feel like that may be what kind of hurt this book. So that is really interesting. Yeah, I think just going off of plot descriptions, I probably would have put the third one first, the second book second, and then the first book last. But off of the page 112, I put the third one last. And that's interesting how that worked. Can't wait to see what Shawn thought of these. If you have thoughts about the passages and how you would have ranked them, if you know anything about these books, I would love to hear about it in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time and thank you for following along. I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.